First, our weekly review of this period of the game. All right, so big news. The game's not over after all. Look back at it, finally been knocked out of first place. In fact, knocked all the way down to fourth. Big props to three teams, Tiger, Spice Rack, and Rack City, all of whom started in the middle of the pack or worse, and through hard work and good decisions have risen to the top. So that's the big news of the day. Here's our plot of sales versus price, but more to the point, sales versus price by period. So this period are the blue circles as usual. And you can see that prices continue to fall. This is sales versus price by team for this period. And we can see the various strategies here. Look rack, excuse me. Look rack at it, set some very high prices. And as a result, did not sell much of anything. Rack set some very low prices. And I don't know if that helped them much or not. So here are the assets by period. So look rack at it was on top. Doggone it. Was on top for the first 5 periods. But they actually lost money, it appears, in the last period. Probably because they didn't sell anything. Who are these guys? These guys are, I think, are 30 rack. They kind of keep jumping back and forth. Stock prices. The bad period had a negative effect on look rack at its stock prices. So you can see here. And who are these guys? And so Spice Rack now has the highest stock prices. I looked through the industry report for anything interesting. Nothing huge in here. CD's Racks is low on cash. There are construction projects underway. Generally speaking, there are a lot of finished goods in storage. CD's Nuts and Bolts seems to be one of the few teams that does not have a lot of inventory. Everybody else seems to still have quite a bit. CD's Racks not only has a little cash, they also have a big construction loan. Here we see look rack at it was the only team to lose money last period. Whereas Party, CD, Rack and Roll led the pack in terms of earnings per share. Still have a couple of sizable dividends. Spice Rack is offering a $2.50 dividend. CD's Racks $2. And there's one pending insider trade. Won't Rack Down is going to buy 500 units of their own stock. Here are the sales figures. Most of the teams sold quite a few. The one big exception, look Rack at it, only didn't even sell 2,000 units. CD's Racks was a little low as well. Several teams sold close to or above 10,000 units in the last period. All right, that's our game summary for the week. So like I said, you can tell it's not over. We're halfway through, right? 12 periods total. There's still room to move, but it's probably time to get started. Does anybody have any questions?
I have a question. When is the time for like 6 periods? Like, do we have to do multiple in a week or something?
There will be 1 week where, and it's not, I think it's the second week in November, we'll do 2 decisions in 1 week. Okay, it's on the schedule, it's posted, the syllabus and schedule are posted on the course site. It's like we'll do one on Monday and one on Thursday or Friday, something like that. Anything else? I don't know why it's asking me that. Never mind. All right, so I don't see any more questions. So today's topic is capacity planning, capacity expansion. The good news is this is a fairly short lecture with some decent homework problems. All right, so capacity planning, capacity expansion. I think we all understand what capacity is. Capacity is the maximum amount of work that your organization can do for a given period of time. And capacity planning is a process of determining what capacity you need out into the future. So basically, when you have a discrepancy between capacity and demand, you have problems. Either if you have too much capacity, then you have underutilized resources, which will undoubtedly cost you money. If you don't have enough capacity, you'll have unfulfilled customers. So there's opportunity cost plus good customer goodwill, both lost there. So this problem has a lot of newsboy problem features to it, where we have random demand and then we have sort of an overage and underage cost. Okay, so we kind of said this already. Not enough capacity, loss of customers and business, extra capacity, you're paying more overhead, you spent more than you needed to on construction, so there's cost involved with having too much capacity. All right, so how can we look ahead and plan in advance what should be our capacities out into the future? So we kind of break this down into 2 problems. One is capacity planning, one is capacity expansion. Capacity planning is more short-term. Capacity expansion is more long-term. And probably the biggest difference that delineates these 2 is that for capacity planning, we usually assume that you can increase or decrease capacity. So here you can think of like increasing the staffing levels on one day versus the next day. Capacity expansion is more long-term. So here you're thinking about building new facilities, right? So once you build a new plant, you can't unbuild it. So typically view these problems where you can only increase capacity or, of course, keep it the same. So capacity planning, how much capacity do we need in future periods? Do we have enough facilities, staffing, machines? How many should we have? And so first thing we're going to look at is sort of a classic staffing problem. Oops, sorry. Click on it. What is going on here? Okay. So in this problem, we're trying to decide how many nurses we need in our emergency room, right? So what this shows is the number of nurses we need throughout a 24-hour period, all right? So the graph shows the number. This is the actual numbers for each of the 24 periods of the day, all right? And we need to schedule nurses so that we have at least as many nurses as we need in each period. Now, there are some possible constraints. So nurses work for 9-hour shifts, and right in the middle, that middle hour, they get a 1-hour break, okay? We could, in theory, require up to 4 hours of overtime for any nurse, but we'd have to pay 1.5 times as much. All right, and so the number of nurses that are working in each hour of the day has to at least meet or exceed the forecast demand. All right, so the problem is find a schedule of nurse shifts that meet the demand and minimize cost, is what I'm sure that says out there, at the lowest cost. All right, so it turns out that if these are the shifts that I schedule, right, so each one of these have 2 nurses who start in the first hour, and that's what their shift looks like, and another nurse an hour later. And it turns out that if you have these shifts, you meet exactly that profile, this profile here. So that was pure luck. Actually, it wasn't pure luck, it's because I did it backwards. However, a slightly different but very similar problem to this is one of the homework problems. Oops, notice that I did not tell you how to solve it. All right, so here's another kind of classic capacity planning problem. This is electricity capacity planning. And this is a problem that's solved all over the country, indeed all over the world every day. For a particular region of electric power, each region is run by what's called an ISO, independent service operator. And typically what they have is a forecast for the demand for electricity throughout the day. So this is a forecast for one particular day in one of the California ISO regions. We can also track actual demand, presumably where my cursor is right about what time it is now. And then we also have available power. And so the ISO controls, among other things, available power and the way they can increase or decrease this by making certain decisions throughout the day. So notice what the kind of the similar feature between this and the nurse scheduling problem is that we have a demand profile, in this case a demand profile for the amount of energy we need to produce. And then we need to make decisions to cover that profile, make sure we meet the demand in each period. So that's kind of a classic capacity planning problem. All right, so we might have various information about how much power is available. In this particular area, we have hydro. We can import from other regions. We have thermal energy in Northern California, nuclear power plants, and renewables, which include solar, wind, and various other possible sources of power. So some of these sources of power are highly variable, whereas others are quite controllable. So for example, nuclear power, you can turn your plant up or down, the same with like coal-fired power plants, turn them up, turn them down. But when it's like wind, you're kind of at the mercy of nature for how much power you actually have available to provide to customers. The same is true for solar. There actually is a kind of a big problem. A lot of people have been working in this area for at least a decade about how best to provide electric power. And the problems get a lot harder when your sources of power are highly uncertain, like solar and wind. So if all of your power was coming from solar and wind, it's actually very difficult to assure that you can meet the demand, just because of the uncertainty involved. I'm going to skip this. Well, that's okay. These are like examples of the kind of issues that the ISO faces and decisions they have to make. So there's one power plant, one generator that takes up to 6 hours to start and is currently offline. So if you decide you need power from this generator, you need to give them at least 6 hours advance warning. So typically this would not be included in the available resources. So let's say it's 7 a.m. The ISO told the generator to be ready to produce energy for the afternoon peak. Then 6 hours later, 1 p.m., that power plant would report that it's ready and would be considered among available resources. So you might have this you have these things called small peaking power plants. Actually, if you look out of your window towards the other side of the Lehigh River, off to the right or to the east, you may see something that looks like a power plant. In fact, that's what it is. That is a small natural gas-fired power plant designed to cover peaks that can be started up very quickly. So if you are experiencing higher demand than you anticipated, you can turn this thing on really quickly. In only 10 minutes, it's ready to go, and then use that to meet your demand. Okay, so you have a giant power plant that's currently running at 50% of its capacity. So it's already running, but that doesn't mean you can instantaneously jump it up to full 100% capacity. Rather, there's sort of a ramp up involved in it, and that will take some time. So again, you can't just automatically have these go from 50% to 100%. That's an example of constraints that the ISOs face in trying to make decisions about what to do throughout the day. Okay, so I made up a simpler example than is you face in the real world, but not unreasonable. Okay, so here are the resources we have available to us. We have 2 nuclear plants, 2 coal plants, and 2 gas cogeneration plants, like the one I talked about across the river. This is the maximum power that they can produce. And this is the lead time. In other words, how far in advance you have to start them up before they're ready to produce. And this is the cost per megawatt hour. Okay, over here in column L, this is our demand each hour in units of megawatt. Yeah.
I still see your PowerPoint screen.
Oh, great. Where were the rest of you on this? Huh? Yeah, I'm looking at you. All right. So here's our example. Start over again. We have 6 possibilities for generating power: 2 nuclear plants, 2 coal plants, and 2 gas cogeneration plants. This is the maximum power per hour they can generate in megawatts per hour. How long it takes in advance to turn them on. Here are the cost per megawatt hour for each of them, right? So we have the kind of big, slow ones that are cheaper, and the small, quick ones, which are more expensive, right? So here, this is our forecast demand in megawatts per hour for each of the hours of the day. And basically, we have to say what percentage of, at what percent of maximum are we going to run each of the plants, right? And so in this case, the solution is, I mean, you could do a solver model or something, but our cheapest plant is nuclear plant number 1 at $100 per megawatt hour. And so clearly we're going to run this 100% of the time because it's cheapest. And then the same is true, the next cheapest is nuclear plant 2. And we're going to run that at 100%, except for the last 2 hours of the day when we can ramp it down a little bit and still meet our demand. All right. And this is, so basically we're going to kind of do the same thing. We're going to next use our coal plant number 1 because it's the next cheapest. And then there are still hours of the day where the first 3 won't meet our demand. So then we'll go to the next cheapest, coal plant number 2, et cetera, et cetera. Right? So basically we make these decisions about how to run our power resources to cover our demand. So again, we have this profile of demand that we need to cover with our resources. So in my solution, I basically ignored the lead time problem. That would make it more interesting. So as we saw, so the basic capacity planning problem, you have some kind of demand profile or shape over time. It could be like forecast expected demand, or maybe to be safe, our profile might be expected demand plus some multiple of sigma to make sure we have enough with some probability. But the point is you have this profile, you need to cover this profile with a variety of resources you have available. So what makes these more complicated in the real world? Well, demand is random, so we don't typically know exactly what it is. Cost of capacity can vary over time. Sometimes capacity can be random. By what I mean, wind and solar, right? The amount of power you get from them is uncertain from one time to the next. Then you have issues we've already talked about, kind of startup time or lead time or ramp up time. And then you also sometimes have storage and inventory problems. Like a big issue in electric power these days is how would you utilize your ability to store power, right? So you can store power during lower demand times and then use it for peak load times. All right, so that's capacity planning. So as you notice, right, the amount that we provide or the capacity that we provide goes up and down over time. It increases and decreases. Capacity expansion, this is more long-term, and it's more like, okay, when do we build a new plant? Once we build a plant, we can't unbuild it, right? So the basic problem, we expect that there will soon no longer be sufficient resources to cover demand in the long run, so we need to expand. This is typically a costly decision, and it involves both fixed and variable costs. Building a plant, fixed costs; operating a plant, variable costs. Time consuming, a lot of lead time on these decisions, and you can't go back. Well, you can go back, but if you do, you'll lose lots and lots of money. And if you build a plant and then decide to close it and sell it off, you will, in fact, lose lots of money. Okay, so should we build new facilities? When should we build them? How big should they be in terms of their capacity? And where should we build them? So where we should build them is one issue we're not discussing today, but the other 3 are. Okay, it's the same kind of problem here. If you expand too early, you got to pay rent or construction costs, interest on loans, and depreciation. You're spending money that could be used elsewhere to make more money. And obviously, if you expand too late, you've missed out on sales and you've lost a lot of goodwill. Okay. These are some of the issues that you typically have to deal with. But I think what I'll do is just kind of show a couple example problems. Okay. So here we've got 20 years over 20 years of time to make decisions. We have an estimated yearly demand each year, and we have to decide how many plants to have available each year. Notice that they can go up or stay the same, but they cannot go down. All right, so the number of plants is our decision variable. The number of plants can only increase or stay the same, has to be integer. Each plant is capable of making 23,000 units per year. The plant operating cost is $25,000 per year. And you get $2 in revenue for every unit sold. All right. So basically, the idea here is that you cannot sell more units than you have capacity for, and you cannot sell more units than you have demand for, just like in the news vendor problem. Here's a second example. This is the same exact example, except it's a stochastic problem. Okay, so our decision is still the number of plants to have each period. That's this middle column. But instead of just a kind of a known fixed demand, we have 5 different random scenarios of demand that we think are representative of what could possibly happen. All right, so now instead of maximizing profit, we're maximizing expected profit, right? So for each demand scenario, we can compute the profit and then ultimately find what is the average profit and then maximize that. So that's deterministic. This is stochastic. These are 2 of the problems on the homework. On both of these, one of the keys is that the number of units you sell each period is the minimum of demand and capacity, right? You can't sell more than you have capacity to make. You can't sell more than you have demand for. So one way you could put this into your Excel solver model is to put in units sold equals the minimum of these 2. However, we all know by now that minimum is a nonlinear function, and we don't like solving nonlinear problems if we don't have to. So the way we deal with it, that's method 2. We make the number of units sold a decision variable in addition to the number of plants. This is another set of decision variables. And then we include the constraints that the unit sold has to be less than or equal to demand, and the unit sold has to be less than or equal to capacity. And because selling units improves our profit, it will always end up being equal to what it says up here, the minimum of the 2 in the first method. So if you use this method, method 2, instead of method 1, you will get a linear model that will be much easier to solve. Remember, this is an integer optimization problem. The number of plants has to be integer. So we can typically solve linear integer problems okay. And we can often solve nonlinear problems okay. But solving integer nonlinear problems is very, very difficult. So that's a hint on how to solve the problem. All right, the next problem we're going to look at is a multi-stage decision stochastic problem on capacity expansion. All right, so demand is random, decisions are multi-period decisions. But here we get to observe the demand in the previous period before we make the next period decisions. And we do not know future period demands, but we may know what the distributions are. So I just want to show an example of what I'm talking about. Well, this is a new type of optimization problem for us. And it involves what's called a scenario tree. All right, so this looks kind of like some of those dynamic programming problems we saw in the past, just to give you some idea what the whole tree looks like. Okay, so each little green node.
We can't see it.
Oh, thank you. Gosh darn it. All right, so we have another tree structure like we've seen in the past. And it's very similar to some of those dynamic programming problems you worked on recently. This is what the tree looks like. Come on. All right. So we start at the beginning, we need to make a decision, all right? And that decision is going to be how many plants to have, how many plants to build, or how many machines to buy, or something like that. Okay, once we made our decision, we get random outcomes. So in this case, we're going to observe what is the demand. And the demand can either be 1,000 or 1,500 or 2,000. We're going to assume that each of those has equal probability, right? So with probability 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, the demand will be 1,000, 1,500, or 2,000. You could say low, medium, and high, if you will, all right? And regardless of where the demand ends up, you now have an opportunity to make the next set of decisions, which is, do you want to add more plants or add more machines this period or not, right? So then you need to make a decision in each one of these green boxes here, right? Because you could end up in each one of those boxes, right? Then, once you made your decision, we observe the demand in period 2. So up here, notice the demand in period 2 is 800, 1,000, and 1,200, where the demand in period 2 down here is 1,700, 2,100, and 2,400, right? So that's why we call it a scenario tree, right? If demand starts out low, it's likely to stay low. Demand starts out high, it's likely to go higher. And so the scenarios are laid out in this tree structure rather than as just like the demand each period. All right, then we get a final opportunity to make decisions in period 3. So for each one of these green boxes, we would want to decide how many plants or machines to buy. And then we'd be done and we could figure out what is our expected profit. All right. So you can solve these kind of the same way we did those dynamic programming. You're probably going to want to work backwards and you're going to want to maximize expected profit. But your solution will entail in each of these green boxes what to do, namely to buy more machines or stick with the number we have from the previous period. You're not allowed to go down in machines. You can either stay the same or buy more. So this is actually a fairly tricky problem. All right, so basically I've discussed all the problems in the homework. And I'm done talking. Does anybody have any questions about anything, the game, the homework? Anybody remember what I talked about today? No? All right, let's see who's hiding from me.